the machine that needed an island. In 1932, the Hawaiian Pineapple Company suffered a collapse so severe that it later entered the company's own history as a named disaster, the crash of 1932. It was not a rumor of trouble or a bad quarter. It was a structural verdict on a machine that had been running too fast for too long, consuming land, capital, and credit at a rate no single island, and it turned out no single balance sheet, could sustain. But to understand why a fruit company could fail so spectacularly, you have to understand what it had become in the first place. And that requires looking at a map of Hawaii, zooming in on a small landmass called Lanai, and confronting a staggering anomaly. In the 1920s, roughly 98% of this island was the private holding of a man who sold canned fruit. The question is not how a grocery staple finances a private fiefdom. The question is what kind of industrial engine requires one, and why that engine broke. The bottleneck.
James Dole was not a farmer. The popular image, the man in the straw hat, the benevolent planter coaxing sweetness from the earth, is closer to a marketing department's postcard than to the man himself. He was a Harvard-educated industrial optimizer who arrived in Hawaii at the turn of the 20th century and saw not a tropical paradise, but a production problem waiting to be solved. At that moment, the pineapple occupied a strange cultural perch. In Europe and the eastern United States, it was a luxury so rare and so ostentatious that wealthy families reportedly rented them for the evening to place as centerpieces at dinner parties, sometimes passing the fruit from host to host before anyone dared cut into it. It was perishable, delicate, and effectively impossible to ship at scale. The pineapple was theater, not commodity. Dole looked at this arrangement and located the real bottleneck. Hawaii's soil and sun could produce pineapples with almost offensive ease.
The bottleneck was processing. A ripe pineapple begins to break down the moment it is cut, and the labor required to peel, core, and slice each one by hand made mass production impractical. A skilled worker with a knife could process on the order of 10 to 15 fruits per minute, estimates vary by source, and that ceiling capped everything: the size of the plantation, the reach of the market, the price of the can. The fruit would remain a luxury for as long as a human hand had to touch every piece. Dole's ambition was to remove the hand from the equation entirely. In 1911, some accounts place the working prototype a year or two later, an engineer named Henry Janaka delivered the machine that dismantled this ceiling. The Janaka machine was a cylinder of blades and sprockets that took a whole pineapple, stripped the skin, punched out the core, and discharged a cylinder of fruit in a single continuous motion. Early versions, requiring only a handful of operators, are generally credited with processing somewhere around 50 fruits per minute. Later refinements push that figure well past 100. A single machine could now do the work of an entire hand processing line, and Dole filled entire factories with them. The pineapple stopped being a perishable luxury and became a shelf-stable commodity, sealed in a can, stacked on pallets, and shipped to grocery stores in Chicago and Kansas City. The machine did not simply accelerate production, it inverted the economics of the whole enterprise. The factory was now faster than the land that fed it. A territory, not a crop. This vertical integration created a fatal asymmetry. Dole's cannery on Oahu could process fruit at a velocity the surrounding plantations struggled to match. The machine demanded more pineapples, which demanded more soil, more water, more infrastructure, and the cycle tightened with every harvest. Oahu did not have enough dirt. The company was running a production engine that was starving for raw material, and the solution it settled on was to acquire a dedicated world, a single contiguous landmass that could be engineered into one synchronized supply chain, free of competing interests, outside owners, or interruption. The Janaka machine had turned a fruit into a commodity. Now it needed a territory to match its appetite. Dole found it on Lanai, 140 square miles of dry grassland and scrub in the lee of Maui, owned largely by the Baldwin family as a cattle ranch. The purchase, finalized in 1922, came to roughly $1.1 million. The sale functioned as a logistical annexation more than a real estate transaction. The Baldwins had run cattle on the island for decades, and Lanai supported a thin population living mostly in the single coastal village of Keomuku, fishing and farming taro in the wetter gullies. By most estimates, the population at the time of sale was around 125, a fraction of the roughly 2,500 people believed to have lived on Lanai in 1823, before a century of disease, land consolidation, and outmigration had thinned the community. The terms of the transfer made no meaningful provision for those still living there. Ranch hands were dismissed, fishing arrangements lapsed, taro patches were left to dry. The company needed an unclaimed surface to build on, and it treated the existing population as an obstacle to be cleared, rather than a party to be negotiated with. The precision the Janaka machine demanded from a single pineapple now extended across an entire island. Every fruit entering the cannery had to match a narrow band of size, ripeness, and geometry, because the machine's blades were calibrated to a specific ideal. A pineapple too large jammed the cylinder. One too small slipped through uncored. That tolerance propagated backward through the whole supply chain. The plantation did not grow pineapples so much as manufacture them, and the entire acreage under cultivation became, in effect, a factory floor where the product was extruded rather than harvested. The island was gridded into fields of roughly 8.5 acres each, separated by dirt roads graded to a consistent width for hauling trucks. Planting was staggered, so fruit ripened on a continuous industrial schedule rather than a seasonal one, since the cannery had no interest in seasons. Soil was fumigated before planting to suppress nematodes and fungi, anything that might introduce variation into the crop. The plants themselves were not grown from seed, but propagated vegetatively from slips and suckers cut from parent stock, cloned repeatedly, because genetic variation was itself a form of inefficiency the system could not tolerate. What the machine erased. This was not a simple handover from ranch to plantation. Under HA and FF,
Baldwin Lanai had been managed as a cattle operation laid thinly over a landscape that had already been losing people for a century. That population of roughly 125 at the time of the 1922 sale, split between the Koele Ranch headquarters and the settlement at Keomuku, was itself the residue of a longer decline. By the time the Gay family arrived on the island in 1902, fewer than 100 native Hawaiians remained. Charles Gay had even experimented with small-scale pineapple cultivation there before Dole's purchase. The Baldwin ranching era was the last functioning layer of a much older human presence on the island, and Dole's acquisition absorbed that layer into the plantation plan without preserving any part of it. What followed amounted to industrial terraforming. Converting the island into a single production line required infrastructure where almost none existed. The terrain was dry, wind-scoured, without a natural harbor or significant freshwater streams.
Dole built a harbor to move canned fruit off the island. He blasted roads through volcanic rock to connect interior fields to coastal loading points. He developed water systems to irrigate roughly 18,000 acres, turning Lanai into what became, by most contemporary accounts, the world's largest pineapple plantation. Every piece of this infrastructure served one purpose: keeping the Janaka machines on Oahu fed and the cans moving toward mainland shelves. At the center of it, Dole built Lanai City, a company town laid out on a grid that served labor logistics as much as habitation. The workforce was imported, largely from the Philippines and Japan, and housed in accommodations the company built, organized, and controlled. Workers lived where the company placed them, walked streets the company surveyed, and bought provisions at stores the company stocked and priced. The 98% ownership figure was the legal architecture of a closed-loop system.
Dole's Hawaiian Pineapple Company owned the dirt the pineapples grew in, the water that irrigated them, the roads that carried them, the harbor that shipped them, the houses the workers slept in, and the stores where they spent their wages. There was no competing employer on the island, no independent landowner of consequence, no alternative economy to fall back on. A worker could not simply quit and find another job down the road because there was no other road leading anywhere else. Wages paid in company scrip circulated back into company commerce and rarely left the balance sheet. This was not a plantation situated on an island. It was an island reorganized as a plantation. Employee records held today at the Lanai Culture and Heritage Center document this arrangement with bureaucratic precision. Cards from between 1923 and 1938 catalog workers by ethnicity and job category. Filipino and Japanese names sorted into rows of laborers, carpenters, and field hands. The camps themselves were segregated by design. Filipino workers housed apart from Japanese workers, both apart from the small number of Hawaiian residents who remained after 1922. Men who did not share a language lived in separate camps and were formally classified by nationality could not easily organize, communicate, or negotiate collectively.
The plantation applied the same logic that governed the Janaka machine to its human workforce. Each worker was an input, sorted by type, deployed where the schedule demanded, and housed in a compartment engineered to keep the line running without friction. The land absorbed a comparable cost. Pineapple monoculture across roughly 18,000 acres stripped nutrients from soil year after year, and the crop's dependence on chemical inputs sent fertilizer and pesticide runoff into the watershed. Aquifers that had sustained both the ranching economy and the earlier native population before 1922 were drawn down to feed a single crop on the dry side of the island. The land was, in a very literal sense, being used up. The collapse. The failure promised in the opening paragraph has a specific shape, even though the company's own literature preferred softer language. By 1931, mainland warehouses were stacked with unsold cases of canned pineapple. The Depression had gutted discretionary spending, and canned pineapple, once a democratized luxury, was among the easier items to cut from a family budget. Dole had spent the previous decade expanding at a pace set by the machine's appetite, not by the market's capacity to absorb what the machine produced. The Janaka line had been engineered for one direction only: more throughput, more cans, more velocity. When demand contracted, the company had no built-in mechanism for contraction. Anywhere in the system, from the irrigation ditches on Lanai to the accounting ledgers on Oahu. The result, in 1932, was a collapse. Contemporary trade coverage described in blunt terms as insolvency. The company's stock lost the large majority of its value from its late 1920s highs. Hawaiian Pineapple Company had financed its Lanai build-out, its cannery expansions, and its shipping infrastructure with debt that assumed continued growth. And continued growth had stopped. James Dole, whose name was stamped on every can, was pushed out of operational control. Castle & Cook, already a minority shareholder and a source of capital, moved in to restructure the company's finances and eventually took majority ownership. By 1933, Dole retained his name on the label, but not his hand on the machine. He stayed on in a diminished role for a few more years before severing ties entirely in 1935 and turning to smaller ventures in the Philippines, a long way from the island he had once controlled outright. This is the part the postcard version of the story tends to omit. The same vertical integration that made Lanai so efficient also made the entire enterprise brittle. A diversified agricultural operation, multiple crops, multiple markets, multiple buyers, can absorb a demand shock in one sector by leaning on another. Dole's operation had no such redundancy. It was a single crop, grown on a single island, processed in a single cannery, sold largely through a single wholesale channel into a single national market. When that market contracted, there was no adjacent revenue stream to soften the fall. The 98% ownership that made Lanai such an efficient production floor was the same structural feature that left the whole system exposed to a single bad decade. Concentration of control and concentration of risk turned out to be the same phenomenon viewed from two angles. Renegotiation, then retreat. Castle & Cook's restructuring did not dismantle the plantation model. It simply took over management and ran the operation more conservatively for the next 3 decades. Lanai's population grew through the 1940s and 1950s as the business stabilized, reaching several thousand residents at its peak, nearly all tied directly or indirectly to the pineapple economy. The segregated camp system that had defined the 1920s and 1930s began to erode, not by company policy, but under pressure from below. In 1951, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union organized plantation workers across Hawaii's pineapple and sugar operations, including on Lanai, and pushed through strikes that forced companies to negotiate wages and conditions on something closer to equal footing. The ethnic camp divisions that had once made organizing difficult didn't disappear overnight, but the labor structure built on keeping Filipino, Japanese, and Hawaiian workers separated lost its economic teeth. Wages rose. Company scrip gradually gave way to ordinary currency. The island remained a company town, but one where the company now had to negotiate rather than simply dictate. None of this addressed the underlying vulnerability that produced the 1932 collapse in the first place. Total dependence on a single export crop grown on a single island for a single distant market. By the 1960s, that vulnerability reasserted itself from a different direction. Not a demand shock this time, but a competitive one. The Philippines, Thailand, and parts of Central America could grow pineapple on land that cost a fraction of Hawaiian real estate, using labor that cost a fraction of Hawaiian wages, and ship it to the same American grocery shelves the Jinica machine had once monopolized. Hawaii's edge had never been unique soil or climate. Pineapple grows well across a wide equatorial band. It had been Dole's roughly 20-year head start in industrializing the process. Once competitors adopted comparable machinery and methods, that head start evaporated, along with the only real justification for shipping fruit across the Pacific at Hawaiian cost structures. Castle & Cooke did not fight the transition. It negotiated the terms of its own retreat. By the 1980s and 1990s, pineapple operations on Lanai were being phased out. Fields went fallow. The cannery shut down. The harbor that had once shipped millions of cans to the mainland saw traffic dwindle to almost nothing. The workforce that had been imported to run the plantation was left on an island where the only employer had exited the business that built it. The same structure, a new product. The pivot to tourism deserves more precision than the fields were replaced by resorts. The Lodge at Kualei and the Manele Bay Hotel opened in 1990 and 1991 respectively, built by Castle & Cooke on land that had grown pineapple for 7 decades. The company marketed the island's isolation, once a liability engineered around with harbors and roads, as a luxury amenity in itself. The same absence of competing landowners that had let Dole run an unchallenged plantation now let his corporate successors run unchallenged resort development, with zoning, water allocation, and land use decisions concentrated in the same hands they had always been concentrated in. When David Murdoch, who by then controlled Castle & Cooke, sold the island to Larry Ellison in 2012, he was not selling a diversified local economy. He was selling the same monopoly structure Dole had assembled 90 years earlier, now dressed for tourism rather than agriculture. The 2012 deal, widely reported at the time, including by BBC News and CBC News, though the purchase price was not disclosed publicly and only later estimated at roughly $300 million, transferred the same consolidated 98% share Dole had assembled in 1922. The feudal geometry survived the crop that had originally justified it. Ellison's stewardship has reproduced the pattern in updated form. Pulama Lanai, the private company formed to manage his holdings, has invested in renovating the resorts, expanding organic farming initiatives, and proposing large-scale solar and battery storage infrastructure aimed at island-wide energy self-sufficiency. A 2012 proposal for a large wind farm intended to export power to Oahu via undersea cable was shelved after resident opposition, a rare case of the island's population successfully resisting a plan imposed from outside, though the underlying land ownership arithmetic that made such top-down proposals possible in the first place remained unchanged. The island's roughly 3,000 residents remain overwhelmingly dependent on 2 employers, the resorts and Pulama Lanai itself. The company-town logic that defined the 1920s persists in a new register. Instead of scrip redeemable only at company stores, there is a single employer controlling most jobs, most housing, and water infrastructure inherited largely unmodified from the irrigation systems Dole built to feed his fields a century ago. The through line from 1922 to 1932 to 2012 is not continuity for its own sake. It is a structural repetition. Dole and Ellison arrived, decades apart, at the same conclusion. An isolated island, once empty of competing claims, functions as an unusually efficient closed system for whoever owns it. Dole's system optimized for pineapple throughput and broke when the market for pineapple contracted. Ellison's system optimizes for tourism revenue and land value, and its exposures, water scarcity, climate risk, dependence on discretionary travel spending, are simply the 21st century equivalents of the brittleness that broke the Hawaiian Pineapple Company in 1932. A monoculture of ownership, it turns out, is a far more durable structure than a monoculture of crop. The fruit changed, the fiefdom did not.